1 minute ago, something shifted in Washington that most people still don't fully understand because it didn't happen with a press conference or a dramatic announcement. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect. Now enjoy the video. But behind closed doors, in a classified briefing room where decisions are made that rarely reach the public in real time, and yet within hours, fragments of that decision began leaking into the global system, triggering reactions not just in policy circles, but across entire governments, because what was being discussed was not a minor disagreement or a routine adjustment, but a fundamental reconsideration of how the United States shares its most sensitive intelligence with its closest allies in Europe, and the implications of that single move are now spreading far beyond what anyone initially expected. According to multiple senior sources familiar with the situation, officials inside began reviewing intelligence sharing frameworks with European partners under a directive strongly influenced by who has returned to power with a far more aggressive vision of how alliances should function. And this time, the focus is not just on trade imbalances or defence spending, but on something far more sensitive and far more consequential, which is the flow of classified information that underpins the entire security architecture of the Western world. What makes this moment so explosive is not just the possibility that intelligence sharing could be reduced, but the reasoning behind it. Because insiders suggest that within Trump's inner circle, there is a growing belief that the European Union is no longer acting as a fully aligned strategic partner, but rather as an independent power centre that often pursues policies directly at odds with American interests, particularly in areas like digital regulation, industrial policy, and relations with global competitors such as. And that perception has fundamentally changed how Washington is now approaching its relationship with Brussels. The inciting event that triggered this internal review reportedly took place during a high-level security meeting that was never meant to become public knowledge, where American and European officials engaged in what one participant later described as an unusually tense exchange over intelligence priorities and information handling. And while the exact details of that conversation remain classified, multiple accounts suggest that it ended with a clear realization on the American side that existing arrangements were no longer being taken for granted, which set in motion a chain of decisions that are only now beginning to surface. Within days of that meeting, technical teams inside US intelligence agencies began quietly mapping out which categories of information are shared automatically with European counterparts and which ones could be restricted without immediately disrupting ongoing operations. And this process, while highly procedural on the surface, carries enormous political weight. And because every adjustment sends a signal not just about policy, but about trust. And in international relations, trust is often more important than formal agreements. As these internal reviews progressed, early signs of change began to appear, subtle at first, almost easy to miss. With European officials noticing delays in receiving certain briefings and a shift in the tone of joint intelligence discussions. And while none of these changes were officially acknowledged, they were enough to raise concerns inside key institutions such as ART, where coordination depends heavily on the seamless exchange of information between American and European systems. The situation escalated rapidly once media organisations began picking up on these anomalies, with reporting unusual disruptions in intelligence cooperation and citing anonymous officials who warned that the transatlantic relationship was entering a period of strategic uncertainty, and at the same time, analysts from released preliminary assessments suggesting that even a partial reduction in intelligence sharing could have long-term consequences for collective security in Europe. Inside Brussels, the reaction was immediate and deeply concerned as officials within the scrambled to understand what was happening and how serious the situation might become. And at the centre of that response was who now faces one of the most complex strategic challenges of her leadership, because she must defend the integrity of the European Union while also preserving a relationship with the United States that remains essential for both economic and security reasons. The difficulty of that balancing act is compounded by the fact that not all European leaders are aligned in their approach to Washington, with figures like advocating for greater European strategic autonomy, while has emphasised the need to maintain stability and avoid escalation. And at the same time, leaders such as and have taken positions that complicate the possibility of a unified European response, which in turn weakens Brussels' ability to negotiate from a position of strength. As the political dimension of the crisis intensified, its impact began to extend into the public sphere. With opinion polls across several European countries indicating a noticeable decline in trust toward the United States as a reliable partner. And although these shifts are still in their early stages, they reflect a broader change in perception that could have lasting consequences for how future policies are shaped on both sides of the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in Washington, supporters of the administration's approach argue that this recalibration is not an act of hostility, but a necessary correction, designed to ensure that American intelligence resources are used in ways that directly serve national interests, and they point to long-standing frustrations over European regulatory policies and defence contributions as evidence that the existing framework has become unbalanced. And with one senior advisor reportedly stating that alliances must evolve or risk becoming liabilities rather than assets. However, critics warn that even limited restrictions on intelligence sharing could trigger unintended consequences, particularly in areas where cooperation is essential for managing global threats, including counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and geopolitical stability. And they emphasise that once trust is eroded, it becomes significantly more difficult to rebuild, especially in a political environment where both sides are under pressure to demonstrate strength rather than compromise. The global implications of this situation are already becoming apparent as other major powers begin to interpret the emerging divide as a sign of weakening cohesion within the Western alliance. With analysts in suggesting that reduced coordination could create strategic openings, while commentators have framed the developments as evidence that the current international order is undergoing a period of fragmentation. And even in regions far removed from Europe, governments are closely monitoring the situation to assess how it might affect their own relationships with the United States. Financial markets have also begun to respond, albeit cautiously, with increased volatility in sectors murtabit with defence and technology as investors attempt to anticipate how changes in transatlantic cooperation might influence regulatory environments and security priorities. And while no major disruptions have occurred yet, the underlying uncertainty is clearly being factored into strategic decisions across multiple industries. At the same time, behind the scenes, there are ongoing efforts to prevent the situation from escalating further, with military and intelligence officials on both sides reportedly maintaining open lines of communication in order to preserve critical operational coordination. And this quiet diplomacy highlights an important reality, which is that even in moments of political tension, there are institutional mechanisms designed to maintain stability and prevent misunderstandings from turning into larger crises. Nevertheless, the fundamental question remains unresolved, which is whether this current phase represents a temporary adjustment or the beginning of a more profound transformation in the transatlantic relationship. And the answer to that question will depend largely on the decisions that are made in the coming weeks. As both Washington and Brussels weigh the costs and benefits of their respective strategies, if the United States proceeds with formalising restrictions on intelligence sharing, it could force Europe to accelerate efforts to develop independent capabilities, potentially leading to a more fragmented but also more autonomous security landscape. Whereas if a compromise is reached, it may preserve the core of the alliance while redefining its terms in ways that reflect the changing balance of power between the two sides. What makes this moment particularly significant is that it is not driven by a single event or policy, but by a broader shift in how global relationships are being reevaluated in an era of increasing competition and uncertainty. And in that sense, the current tension between the United States and Europe can be seen as part of a larger pattern that is reshaping the international system as a whole. So the real question is not just what happens next in this specific situation, but what it reveals about the future of alliances in a world where shared interests can no longer be assumed and where every partnership is subject to constant renegotiation. And as this story continues to unfold, the decisions made now will likely have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate crisis. Will this moment be remembered as a strategic adjustment that ultimately strengthened the alliance by forcing it to adapt, or as the beginning of a gradual unravelling that weakened one of the most important partnerships in modern history? And if trust continues to erode, who stands to gain the most from that shift? And perhaps most importantly, can the foundations of cooperation that have held for decades survive the pressures they are now facing? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a transformation that will redefine global politics for a generation to come? If you want to stay ahead of these developments and understand what happens before it becomes headline news, make sure you stay connected, because this story is still evolving and the next move could change everything.